My name is Elena Mitchell. I'm 32 years old. And I was the family disappointment until one day everything changed and they had to apologize. But this isn't just some feel-good story about proving people wrong. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally decide you're not worth their time. They called me the family failure for so long, I started believing it was tattooed on my forehead. Like every single person who looked at me could see the word disappointment flashing in neon lights above my head. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely? If you've ever been written off by your own family, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like. Because what I'm about to share will show you exactly how I turned their cruelty into the greatest motivation of my life. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Every gathering, every holiday, every single phone call was a reminder that I wasn't enough, not smart enough like my brother David who became a surgeon, not polished enough like my sister Rebecca who married some wealthy investment banker, not successful enough to deserve a seat at the table where my family discussed important things. I'd walk into my parents' house for Sunday dinner, and the energy would shift. Like someone had turned down the volume on joy the second I stepped through the door. My mother, Patricia, would greet David with hugs and questions about his patients. She'd gush over Rebecca's designer handbag and ask about her upcoming vacation to the Bahamas. But when she turned to me, her smile would fade just a little. Her voice would drop half an octave, and she'd say something like, "Oh, Elena, you made it." As if my arrival was somehow unexpected, even though she'd invited me. My father, Richard, wouldn't even look up from his newspaper most times. Just a grunt of acknowledgement that I'd entered the room, and that silence said more than any words ever could. But here's the thing about disappointment. Tit has a twin sister called Fire, and when you've been burned enough times by the people who are supposed to protect you, you start building something different inside yourself, something they never saw coming. For years I believed their version of me, because I didn't know any better. When everyone around you treats you like you're broken, you start thinking maybe they're right. Maybe you really are the problem. I dropped out of college at 21 because I couldn't afford it and my parents refused to help me the way they helped my siblings. I bounced between retail jobs and waitressing gigs, trying to make rent in a tiny studio apartment that smelled like mildew and regret. And I showed up to Christmas dinner alone year after year while Rebecca flaunted her perfect marriage and David brought whatever gorgeous date he'd met at the hospital. Stay until the end of this video because the day they had to say sorry wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about rubbing my success in their faces. It was about something far more powerful than that. It was about finally proving to myself that their labels never defined who I really was. This story isn't about proving people wrong out of spite. It's not some petty tale of getting even with family members who doubted me. It's about what happens when you finally decide your worth isn't up for a family vote anymore. When you stop waiting for permission to be valuable and start building a life that doesn't require anyone else's approval. For most of my 20s, I was the punchline in my own family's story. The cautionary tale parents tell their kids about what happens when you don't apply yourself, when you don't follow the path they've laid out for you. My brother David would bring colleagues to family dinners, and my mother would proudly introduce him as our son, the surgeon, her voice practically singing with pride. And then she'd turn to me and say, "And this is Elena. She's still figuring things out." And everyone would nod politely, while I died a little inside. Rebecca wasn't much better. She'd corner me at weddings, and ask in that condescending tone, "So are you seeing anyone special?" Knowing full well I was single. Knowing full well she was about to launch into a 20-minute monologue about her husband, Brandon's latest promotion, or their plans to buy a second home in Aspen. The worst part wasn't the comparisons. It was the looks, those quick glances my parents would exchange when I talked about my life. Like they were mentally calculating how much longer they'd have to pretend to care before they could change the subject to something more interesting, meaning anything involving David or Rebecca. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 27. I'd just gotten promoted to assistant manager at the boutique where I worked, and I was genuinely excited to share the news because for once I had something positive to contribute to the conversation. I waited for a pause in Rebecca's story about her husband's Christmas bonus, and I said, "Hey everyone, I got some good news this week. I got promoted and I'm now managing the evening shift." And you know what my father said? He looked at me over his reading glasses. took a sip of his wine, and said, "Well, that's nice, Elena. But when are you going to get a real career?" The table went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before my mother jumped in with, "Your father just means it would be nice too. See you doing something with more stability, sweetheart." And just like that, my accomplishment was reduced to nothing. I didn't cry at that dinner table. I didn't scream or argue or defend myself. I just felt something shift inside me, like a door closing on the version of me that still needed their approval to breathe, that still measured my worth by whether or not my parents smiled when I walked into a room. That night, I drove home to my cramped apartment, sat on my secondhand couch, and made a decision that would change everything. I was done performing for an audience that would never applaud, done trying to fit into a family portrait where there was no frame big enough to include me. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about resurrection, about becoming the person you were always meant to be once you stopped letting other people write your story. And what happened next? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Because the transformation I went through wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and deliberate. And by the time my family noticed what I'd become, it was too late for them to take credit for any of it. Being the disappointment isn't one moment. It's not a single conversation or one bad date. It's 1,000 paper cuts disguised as concern, jokes that aren't really jokes, and conversations that suddenly go quiet the second you walk into the room because nobody wants to pretend they care about your life anymore. My mother Patricia would introduce my siblings with this energy that radiated pride. Her whole face would light up when she talked about David's surgical residency or Rebecca's volunteer work at some fancy charity gala, their accomplishments spilling out of her mouth naturally like she'd been rehearsing the speech for weeks. But when it came to me, there was always this pause, this moment where her smile would freeze and she'd search for something, anything positive to say before settling on. And this is my daughter Elena. She's working retail right now. And the way she said retail made it sound like I was doing something shameful, something temporary that I should have grown out of by now, like acne or bad fashion choices. Before I continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because what my family did to me over the years is going to shock you, and I need you to stick around to see how I turned this pain into power. I learned to make myself small at family events. Not physically, but emotionally. I'd sit at the corner of the table during holiday dinners, where expectations couldn't reach me, where failure was already assumed so I couldn't fall any further than I'd already fallen in their eyes. My Aunt Carol would ask David about his patients and listen with genuine fascination, nodding along like he was delivering a TED Talk, and then she'd turn to me and say, "So Elena, are you still at that little shop?" And the word little carried so much weight, so much judgment packed into 5 letters. I'd smile and nod and say yes, and she'd pat my hand like I was a child who'd just scraped my knee. This patronizing gesture that said, "Poor thing, maybe next year will be better for you." Except next year never was better because they'd already decided who I was, and nothing I did could change that narrative. My cousin Jennifer got engaged around this time, and at the engagement party, my uncle Stephen made a toast about how proud he was of all his nieces and nephews. And he listed everyone's accomplishments one by one: David saving lives, Rebecca's beautiful home, my cousin Mark's promotion to regional manager, and when he got to me, he paused, cleared his throat, and said, "And Elena? Well, Elena's got a good heart." And everyone laughed, like that was the participation trophy of compliments. The weight of that label, disappointment, underachiever, the one who never quite made it, becomes part of your identity when you hear it enough times. When every family gathering reinforces the same story about who you are and who you'll never be. I started declining invitations to weddings and birthday parties because I couldn't handle another conversation where someone asked what I was doing with my life and I had to watch their face fall when I gave them an honest answer. My brother David never understood why I pulled away. He called me once and said, "Mom's upset you didn't come to Thanksgiving. You know how she gets." And I wanted to scream at him that Mom had spent the last 10 Thanksgivings making me feel invisible, that it's easy to show up when you're the golden child everyone wants to celebrate. But I didn't scream, I just said I had to work, which was partially true, but mostly I just couldn't sit through another meal where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. What I didn't know then was that this distance I was creating, this space between me and my family's expectations, was going to become the exact thing I needed to finally transform into someone they couldn't ignore anymore. And that transformation was already beginning whether I realized it or not. Thanksgiving dinners felt like performance reviews where I was always rated below expectations without anyone actually asking what I was trying to build, what dreams I was carrying, or whether their constant comparisons were slowly killing whatever ambition I had left inside me. The dining room table became a stage where my siblings performed their success, and I sat in the audience watching, applauding politely while dying inside because I knew no matter what I accomplished, it would never be enough to earn the same applause they received for simply existing. My father, Richard, had this way of steering every conversation. Back to David's medical career, someone would mention they had a headache, and suddenly, Richard was launching into a story about how David diagnosed some rare condition that other doctors missed, his voice swelling with pride that he never, not once, used when talking about me. Rebecca's achievements were celebrated like national holidays. When she and her husband Brandon bought their second home, my parents threw them a housewarming party and invited half the neighborhood to celebrate. But when I finally saved enough money to move out of my studio apartment into a modest one-bedroom, my mother's only comment was, "Well, at least you're not living with roommates anymore at your age." My brother's medical conferences were treated like family events. My parents would plan their schedules around David's speaking engagements. They'd drive 3 hours to watch him present research papers to a room full of doctors. And they'd come home with stories about how brilliant he was, how respected, how everyone kept telling them what an exceptional son they'd raised. Meanwhile, my attempt to start a small graphic design business from my apartment was met with patronizing nods and suggestions to find something stable. "Sweetheart, something with benefits and a retirement plan." I'd spent 6 months teaching myself design software through YouTube tutorials and online courses. I'd built a portfolio and landed 2 small clients who actually paid me for my work. And I was so proud of this thing I'd created from nothing that I made the mistake of sharing it at Sunday dinner. My mother looked at my laptop screen for maybe 10 seconds before saying, "That's nice, dear, but is this really sustainable? What happens when these clients don't need you anymore?" And my father added, "Your brother could probably connect you with the hospital's marketing department if you need a real job." As if what I was building wasn't real, wasn't legitimate, wasn't worth taking seriously because it didn't come with a prestigious title or a corporate office. Every achievement of my siblings became an unspoken reminder of what I wasn't successful enough, settled enough, worthy enough of the family name or the attention that came with it. When Rebecca got pregnant with her first child, the family lost their minds with excitement. My mother cried happy tears. My father opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for something special. And suddenly every conversation revolved around baby names and nursery colors and Rebecca's pregnancy glow. I was genuinely happy for her. I really was. But watching my parents fuss over her with this level of devotion I'd never experienced made something inside me hardened because I realized they had infinite love and attention for my siblings, but only scraps left over for me. My Aunt Linda pulled me aside at Rebecca's baby shower and said, "So when are you going to settle down and give your parents grandchildren? Rebecca's beating you to it." And I smiled through the rage because what was I supposed to say? That I couldn't afford to date seriously because I was working 2 jobs to pay rent. That I couldn't imagine bringing a child into this family, knowing they might treat my kid the way they treated me. The comparison wasn't just between me and my siblings anymore. It had evolved into this constant measurement of my worth against milestones I hadn't reached, paths I hadn't taken, and a version of success I'd never agreed to chase in the first place. And that realization was about to change absolutely everything. There was one dinner, one comment from my father that broke something inside me, not in a destructive way where everything shattered into pieces I couldn't put back together, but in a way that cleared space for something new to grow, like a controlled demolition that makes room for a better foundation. It was a Sunday in late September, one of those perfect autumn evenings where the air smells like fallen leaves and possibility. And my mother had invited the whole family over for what she called a casual dinner, but what really meant she wanted to show off the new dining room furniture she and my father had bought. David brought his girlfriend Claire, this stunning pediatric nurse who laughed at all his jokes and looked at him like he'd hung the moon. And Rebecca showed up with Brandon and their 6-month-old daughter Olivia, who everyone passed around like a trophy while cooing about whose eyes she had and whose smile she inherited. I sat at my usual spot at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of wine and trying to participate in conversations that didn't really include me. Watching my family celebrate each other while I faded into the background like wallpaper nobody notices until it starts peeling. We were halfway through dinner when my father started talking about legacy, about what it means to build something that lasts beyond your own lifetime. And he was looking at David when he said it, this proud gleam in his eyes that I'd seen 1,000 times but never directed at me. He talked about how important it is to make your mark on the world, to do work that matters, to raise children who understand the value of excellence and ambition. And the whole time he was speaking, I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller in my chair. Then he raised his glass and said, I want to make a toast to my children. Well, at least we have 2 out of 3 to be proud of. And he laughed like it was a joke, like those words weren't a knife sliding between my ribs. And everyone at that table laughed with him, except me. My mother reached over and patted my hand, her version of damage control, and said softly, he's just teasing, Elena. You know your father's sense of humor. But we both knew he wasn't teasing. We both knew that in his mind, I was the failure, the disappointment, the one child who didn't live up to the Mitchell family standards. And that knowledge was finally, mercifully, setting me free. I didn't cry at that table. I didn't scream or argue or defend myself the way part of me wanted to. I just felt something shift inside me, like tectonic plates realigning, like a door closing on the version of me that still needed their approval to breathe, that still measured my worth by whether or not my parents smiled when I walked into a room. I finished my dinner in silence while everyone moved on to talking about David's upcoming promotion and Rebecca's plans to renovate her kitchen. And when dessert was served, I excused myself early, claiming I had work in the morning, which was true but irrelevant, because the real reason I needed to leave was that I couldn't spend another second in that house pretending their words didn't matter. I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, letting the night air sting my face. And when I got to my apartment, I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat on my couch in the darkness and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. My own father had declared me unworthy in front of my entire family. And not a single person had defended me, not my mother or my siblings or anyone. And that betrayal was the last push I needed to stop living for their approval and start building something entirely my own. I stopped going to family events for a while after that dinner, not out of anger or some petty desire for revenge, but out of pure necessity. I needed silence to hear my own voice again, to remember who I was before I became their project to fix, their cautionary tale to reference whenever they wanted to feel better about their own choices. For weeks, I ignored my mother's phone calls, asking why I'd missed Rebecca's birthday brunch or my father's retirement party planning meeting. And each time I let it go to voicemail, I felt lighter, like I was shedding layers of expectation that had been suffocating me for years. My brother David sent me a text that said, "You're being dramatic. It was just a joke. Stop making everything about you." And I blocked his number, because I realized he'd never understand what it felt like to be the punchline, to carry the weight of disappointing people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. If you're watching this and you've ever had to distance yourself from toxic family members to protect your peace, hit that subscribe button and drop a like right now, because what I did next with all that quiet space I created is going to blow your mind, and you need to see how this transformation unfolded. In that quiet, in those weeks and then months of minimal contact with my family, I found something I'd buried under years of trying to fit their definition of success. I was good at solving problems, at seeing patterns other people missed, at turning chaos into systems that actually worked. I'd always had this analytical brain that could look at a mess and figure out how to organize it, how to make it efficient, how to create order from disorder. But I'd never pursued it seriously because my family had convinced me I wasn't smart enough for anything that required real intelligence. One night I was scrolling through job listings, not really looking for anything specific but just exploring possibilities, and I came across a posting for a data analytics certification program that promised to teach you everything you needed to know to start a career in 6 months. The tuition was steep, more money than I had in my savings account. But something about it clicked in my brain like a puzzle piece finding its place. And I thought, why not? What do I have to lose except more years of being miserable in jobs that go nowhere? I decided to go back to school for data analytics, not because it would impress my family or prove anything to them, but because for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious about something that had nothing to do with their opinions or their approval. I enrolled in the program 3 days later, using money I'd been saving for a trip I kept postponing and a small loan I qualified for, and I made myself a promise that I wouldn't tell anyone in my family what I was doing until I had something real to show for it. No more sharing dreams, only to watch them get dismissed or minimized or compared to my siblings' achievements. My mother called me a few times asking what I'd been up to, and I gave vague answers about working and staying busy. Nothing that would invite follow-up questions or judgment. My apartment became my sanctuary and my classroom. I'd come home from my retail job exhausted, but I'd make coffee and open my laptop and dive into lessons about statistical analysis and data visualization. Concepts that initially felt impossible but gradually started making sense as I practiced. There was something powerful about working towards something in complete silence, without the pressure of anyone's expectations, or the fear of anyone's disappointment if I failed. And that freedom to try and possibly fall on my face without witnesses gave me courage I'd never had before. What I didn't know then was that this quiet decision, this choice to invest in myself while my family barely noticed I'd pulled away, was going to become the foundation of the biggest transformation of my life. And the journey I was about to embark on would eventually force every single person who'd written me off to confront how wrong they'd been about who I was and what I was capable of becoming. Transformation isn't a montage, like you see in movies where inspiring music plays and suddenly everything changes in 3 minutes. Sits late nights after full shifts, when your body is screaming for sleep but you force yourself to stay awake for just one more lesson. It's online courses on a cracked laptop that takes 5 minutes to load a video. And it's teaching yourself skills that don't come with encouragement or witnesses or anyone telling you that you're on the right path. I'd work my retail job from 10 in the morning until 6 at night, dealing with difficult customers and standing on my feet until my legs ached. And then I'd come home and study from 7 until midnight. Sometimes later if I was working on an assignment that was due. My coworkers thought I was antisocial because I stopped going out for drinks after shifts. Stopped participating in the group chats where everyone complained about management and shared memes. But the truth was, I didn't have energy for anything except work and school and the bare minimum of sleep I needed to function. There were nights I cried from frustration because I didn't understand probability distributions or regression analysis. Nights I almost quit because it felt too hard and I was too tired, and maybe my family was right that I wasn't cut out for anything that required real intelligence. Nobody knew I was studying because I didn't announce it, didn't post about it on social media, didn't mention it in the occasional text exchanges I had with my mother when she'd check in with her usual "hope you're doing well, let us know if you need anything" message that never actually came with offers of real help. I'd learned years ago that my family treated my goals like wishful thinking, like cute little hobbies I'd picked up that would inevitably fizzle out when reality hit. And I couldn't afford to let their doubt become my own this time. This was too important, too personal, too much of a lifeline for me to risk someone else's negativity, poisoning it before it had a chance to grow. My brother David sent me a birthday card that year with a gift card to Target inside and a note that said, "Thought you could use this for work clothes or whatever." And the dismissiveness in those 2 words "or whatever" told me everything I needed to know about how little he thought of my life. I used that gift card to buy a notebook and pens for my coursework. And there was something satisfying about turning his condescension into tools that would eventually prove him wrong. For 18 months I lived to live the disappointing daughter they saw at occasional dinners, when I couldn't avoid family obligations anymore. And the woman quietly building credentials and skills they didn't know existed. Credentials that were slowly transforming me into someone completely different from the failure they'd labeled me. When I did show up to family events, usually just major holidays, I couldn't skip without causing drama. I'd sit quietly and let them talk about their lives, while revealing nothing about mine, except surface-level details about my retail job. My mother asked once if I was seeing anyone special and I said no, and she sighed like my singleness was another disappointment to add to the list. Never mind that I didn't have time to date because I was too busy building a future she couldn't even imagine. Rebecca showed off her second pregnancy announcement at Easter dinner, and everyone celebrated with champagne and tears of joy. And I smiled and congratulated her while thinking about the certification exam I had scheduled for the following week. The exam that would officially qualify me to work as a data analyst if I passed. Nobody asked what was new in my life. Nobody noticed I'd lost weight from stress or that I had dark circles under my eyes from exhaustion. And that invisibility became my superpower because it meant I could transform in peace without anyone watching, without anyone waiting for me to fail so they could say they'd seen it coming all along. I landed my first contract with a mid-sized company called Riverside Solutions about 3 weeks after I got my certification. And it wasn't glamorous or prestigious or anything my family would have been impressed by on paper, but it was mine. I'd earned it through cold emails and portfolio samples and an interview, where I actually knew what I was talking about for the first time in my professional life. They needed someone to analyze their customer data and optimize their sales approach because they were losing clients and couldn't figure out why. And the owner, a woman named Janet Chun, took a chance on me even though I had no official work experience in the field. She said something during that interview that stuck with me. "I don't care about your resume. I care about whether you can solve problems. And from what I've seen in your portfolio, you can." And that vote of confidence from a stranger meant more to me than years of my family's criticism. I charged them less than I should have because I was desperate to prove myself. Desperate to have something real I could point to and say, "I did this. This is mine. This matters." And I threw myself into that project like my life depended on it because in a way, it did. Within 3 months, their revenue increased by 32% because of systems I built. Because of patterns I identified in their customer behavior that no one else had noticed. Because I had figured out they were losing clients during the onboarding process due to confusing communication, and I'd redesigned their entire workflow to be clearer and more efficient. Janet called me into her office. We met over Zoom since I was working remotely, and she had this huge smile on her face when she told me the numbers. When she showed me the graphs that proved my work had directly impacted their bottom line in measurable ways, she said, "Elena, you've saved this company. I'm not exaggerating. We were 6 months away from having to lay off staff, and now we're hiring." And she offered me a bonus and asked if I'd be interested in taking on more projects with them on a retainer basis. I said yes before she even finished the question. And when I hung up that call, I sat in my apartment and cried. Not sad tears, but relief tears. The kind that come when you finally have proof that you're not the failure everyone said you were. That your brain works and your ideas matter and you can build something valuable if given the chance. I still didn't tell my family. Not because I was hiding, but because I was protecting something fragile. My belief that I was capable, which I couldn't risk them diminishing before it had time to root deeply enough that their opinions couldn't kill it anymore. I needed more evidence. More proof, more projects that showed this wasn't a fluke or beginner's luck, but something real I could sustain and grow. Over the next 6 months, I took on 4 more clients, small businesses and startups that needed data analysis but couldn't afford big consulting firms. And I built a reputation for being reliable and effective and actually delivering results that impacted their operations. My income from analytics work surpassed what I was making at my retail job. So I walked into my manager's office and gave 2 weeks' notice. And she looked shocked because I'd been there for 4 years and she'd assumed I'd stay forever since I wasn't really going anywhere. I didn't tell her where I was going or what I was doing next. Jess smiled and said I had other opportunities. And the look on her face when I walked out on my last day carrying a box of my personal items was sweet because for once someone was watching me leave and wondering what they'd missed about me. What potential they'd failed to see while I was standing right in front of them. The turning point came when a regional business journal called Midwest Business Quarterly published a feature on rising analytics consultants. And I was one of 5 professionals highlighted for innovative client results that were making waves in the small business community. I didn't even know I'd been nominated until a journalist named Marcus Wright called me asking for an interview, explaining that one of my clients had submitted my name and case study to their emerging talent series they ran every quarter. I almost said no because part of me still didn't believe I deserved that kind of recognition. Still heard my father's voice in my head saying I'd never amount to anything significant. But something stronger pushed me to say yes. To sit for that interview and talk about my work and my approach to solving business problems through data. The article came out on a Tuesday morning in April, complete with my photo and a 2-page spread detailing 3 of my most successful projects. And within hours my phone started blowing up with messages from potential clients and colleagues I hadn't spoken to in years. all suddenly interested in what I was doing and how I'd gotten there. My mother's friend Carol saw it first. She subscribed to that journal because her husband owned a manufacturing business and she liked staying informed about the local business community, and she called my mom asking why she never mentioned her daughter was doing such impressive work and getting featured in publications. That's when my family realized they'd been looking at me with the wrong lens for years. That while they'd been dismissing me as the failure who couldn't get her life together, I'd been quietly building a consulting practice that was earning me more than my retail job ever had and getting recognized by people who actually understood what I was doing. My mother called me that afternoon, and her voice had this strange quality I'd never heard before, something between surprise and embarrassment, and she said, "Elena, Carol just sent me an article about you. Why didn't you tell us you were doing analytics work?" And I wanted to laugh because the answer was so obvious. I hadn't told them because they'd never asked, because they'd spent years making it clear they weren't interested in my life unless it met their standards of success. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed and you've hit that like button. Because what happens when I finally face my family after this article comes out is the moment everything changes. And you're going to want to see how they react when they can't deny my success anymore. By the time my mother called me, the article had already been shared in family group chats I wasn't part of, creating a strange collision between the daughter they'd dismissed and the professional that strangers were praising in print. My brother David texted me later that evening, just 3 words. Saw the article. No congratulations or apology for years of condescension. Just acknowledgement that he'd seen proof I wasn't the failure he'd assumed I was. Rebecca sent a longer message saying she was proud of me and asking why I'd been keeping secrets. As if my silence about my transformation was the problem, rather than their years of making me feel like nothing I did would ever matter to them. My father didn't reach out at all, which hurt in a way I didn't expect because some part of me still wanted his approval even after everything. Still wanted him to call and say he'd been wrong about me. But his silence was its own kind of message. Pride doesn't evaporate just because you're confronted with evidence you were wrong. And my father had built his identity around being right about everything, including his assessment of his children. What I didn't know was that this article would force a reckoning at my brother's engagement party 2 weeks later. A confrontation I hadn't planned, but desperately needed, where years of hurt and dismissal would finally be addressed, and my family would have to decide whether they were capable of seeing me as close I actually was, rather than who they'd decided I'd always be. My brother David's engagement party became the stage for something none of us planned. He was marrying Claire, the pediatric nurse he'd been dating for 2 years, and my mother had organized this elaborate celebration at a country club with about 60 guests, including extended family, David's colleagues, and friends from medical school. I showed up as a courtesy, because declining would have caused more drama than attending, and I'd promised myself I was done letting their opinions control my choices, which meant I could go to family events without needing anything from them emotionally. But the moment I walked into that country club ballroom, expecting the usual polite distance and superficial small talk, I felt the air shift. People were looking at me differently, with curiosity instead of pity. And conversations seemed to pause when I approached groups like they'd been talking about me before I arrived. My Aunt Linda was the first to say something direct, pulling me aside near the bar and saying, "I saw that article about you, Elena. I had no idea you were doing such important work." And the way she said important felt like an apology wrapped in surprise, like she was recalibrating her entire understanding of who I was, based on a magazine spread. My father approached me first from the immediate family, which shocked me because we hadn't spoken since that disastrous dinner where he'd joked about only having 2 children to be proud of, and his voice was lower than usual, almost tentative. When he said they'd seen the article and had no idea I was doing that kind of work, I realized he meant it. They genuinely had no idea, because they'd never asked. Because every conversation we'd had for years had been them talking about David and Rebecca's lives while I sat silently absorbing their accomplishments, like that was my role in the family dynamic. He cleared his throat and said something about how analytics was a growing field and good money if you can get the clients. And I could see him trying to process this new information about me, trying to fit this successful consultant version of Elena into the box, where he'd kept the disappointing daughter who worked retail and couldn't keep her life together. I didn't make it easy for him. I didn't smile or reassure him, or pretend his years of dismissal hadn't heard. I just said, "Yeah, it's been going well," and let the awkward silence sit between us until he nodded and walked away to refill his drink. My mother pulled me aside about 20 minutes later with tears in her eyes. And for a moment I thought she'd congratulate me. Thought maybe this would be the moment she acknowledged how wrong she'd been. But instead she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" As if my silence, not their years of dismissal, was the problem we needed to address. Her voice had this wounded quality, like I'd betrayed her by not sharing my transformation. Like I owed them updates on my life, even after they'd made it abundantly clear they weren't interested unless I met their standards. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd introduced me with embarrassment at parties, who'd patted my hand with pity at dinners, who'd made me feel small and insufficient for as long as I could remember. Something inside me finally snapped. Not with anger, but with clarity about what this conversation really was. She wasn't crying because she was proud of me. She was crying because she'd been caught. Because the article had exposed her and my father and my siblings as people who'd completely misjudged someone they were supposed to love unconditionally. And now she had to reconcile the narrative she'd been telling herself with the reality. Standing in front of her wearing a dress I'd bought with money from my consulting work. Money I'd earned doing exactly what they'd said I'd never be capable of doing. I didn't plan to say what came next, but years of swallowed words have a way of finding their moment when you're finally strong enough to release them without crumbling. And standing there in that country club ballroom, with my mother's tearful question hanging in the air, I felt every paper cut, every dismissive comment, every painful comparison rise up in my throat demanding to be spoken. I looked at my mother and said, "I didn't tell you because you stopped asking who I was a long time ago, Mom. You stopped being curious about my life the moment you decided I wasn't living up to your expectations. And I couldn't share something this important with people who had already made up their minds that I was a disappointment." Her face went pale and she opened her mouth to protest, but I kept going because if I stopped I'd lose my nerve. And I needed her to hear this, even if it hurt, even if it made me the villain in her version of our family story. I told her about the dinner, where Dad joked about having 2 out of 3 children to be proud of. About the years of introducing me with apologies in her voice while she bragged about David and Rebecca. About every time she'd suggested I find something stable like my dreams were cute hobbies that would inevitably fail. And with each example I watched her face change from defensive to something that looked almost like recognition. The room went still, not literally. The party was still happening around us, but in our little corner near the window overlooking the golf course, time seemed to stop as my mother processed what I was saying and my father and siblings drifted over, sensing something important was happening. My sister Rebecca looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot and avoiding eye contact. And my brother David stared at his drink like the ice cubes held answers he didn't want to face. My father's face showed something I'd never seen before, not anger or dismissal, but actual recognition that they'd been wrong. Not just about my career potential, but about me as a person. About who I was beneath the labels they'd stuck on me without bothering to look closer. I wasn't yelling, wasn't being dramatic or cruel. I was just finally telling the truth about what it had felt like to grow up as the family disappointment. To carry that weight while watching my siblings receive unconditional love and support I'd never experienced. And the truth was cutting through years of denial like a knife through wet paper. My mother finally said the words I didn't know I needed. Her voice breaking on every syllable. "We're sorry we made you feel invisible. And you deserved so much better from us. You deserved parents who saw you and supported you instead of comparing you to standards that weren't fair or reasonable." In that moment, something I'd carried for years finally had a place to rest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Validation that what I'd experienced was real and wrong, and not something I'd imagined or been too sensitive about. My father added quietly, "I was wrong about you, Alina. I was wrong about what you were capable of, and I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough." And hearing those words from the man who'd spent years dismissing me felt surreal. Like I'd crossed into an alternate dimension where my family was capable of admitting mistakes and taking accountability. My siblings stayed silent, but their faces told their own stories. David looked ashamed, probably remembering every condescending comment he'd made about my little jobs, and Rebecca's eyes were red like she was fighting tears. Perhaps recognizing all the times she could have defended me, but chose comfort over courage. The apology didn't erase the past, didn't undo years of damage. but it cracked open a door I thought was sealed forever. And what walked through that door in the minutes that followed would reshape our family in ways none of us could have predicted. What followed wasn't a single apology, but a collective reckoning that unfolded over the next 30 minutes as my brother's engagement party transformed into something none of the guests expected. My father, to everyone's shock including mine, stood up in front of the family and friends gathered there and said out loud that they'd treated me unfairly, that their expectations were rigid and their judgments were wrong. He didn't make excuses or try to soften it with explanations about how they'd only wanted the best for me. He just owned it completely, saying, "We measured Elena's worth by standards that didn't account for who she actually was. And we failed her as parents because we were too proud to admit we were wrong, even when the evidence was right in front of us." The room had gone completely silent, 60 people holding champagne glasses and appetizer plates, frozen in place watching this man known for his stubborn certainty publicly admit he'd misjudged his own daughter for years. My Uncle Stephen, the same one who'd given that toast about everyone's accomplishments except mine, looked down at his shoes, and I saw several relatives exchanging uncomfortable glances as they realized they'd participated in my marginalization through their own silence or their parroting of my parents' dismissive attitude. My siblings added their own apologies, and these felt even more significant because they came from people who'd benefited from the favoritism I'd suffered under. People who could have spoken up but chose the comfort of being the golden children over the discomfort of defending their sister. David stepped forward first, his voice cracking slightly when he said, "I used you as a cautionary tale to feel better about myself. I made jokes about your life at hospital dinners to entertain my colleagues. And I never once considered what it must have felt like to be you watching me receive all the praise and support you deserved to." He looked directly at me when he said it, not hiding behind vague language or half-hearted acknowledgement, and I saw genuine remorse in his eyes that might have been impossible for him to access before this moment forced him to confront his own complicity. Rebecca's apology was quieter but no less important. She confessed she'd stayed silent when she should have defended me, that she'd heard our parents make cruel jokes about my life, and she'd laughed along or said nothing because it was easier than risking their disapproval. And she was sorry for choosing her own comfort over my dignity again and again across years of family gatherings. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't neat or tied up with a pretty bow like apologies are in movies. But it was real, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt seen by my family not as the disappointment who got lucky, but as someone who'd earned her place through grit and determination they'd never acknowledged because they were too busy looking at who they wanted me to be instead of who I actually was. Claire, David's fiancée, came up to me afterward and said something that stuck with me. "I've heard them talk about you for 2 years, and I always wondered why their descriptions never matched the person I met at dinners. And now I understand they were describing someone who didn't exist, a character they'd created rather than the real you." Other relatives approached throughout the evening, some offering apologies of their own, others just acknowledging they'd been wrong in their assessments and assumptions. And while part of me wanted to be bitter about how it took public recognition for them to see my value, another part was just relieved that the truth was finally out there, that I no longer had to carry the weight of their false narrative about who I was while simultaneously building the life that proved them wrong. That night taught me something crucial about how people see each other and how easy it is to mistake labels for truth. The people who label you aren't doing it because they see clearly. They're doing it because labels are easier than looking closely, easier than asking questions, easier than admitting they might be wrong about someone they've known for years. My family had created a story about who I was when I dropped out of college at 21, and they'd spent the next decade reinforcing that story with every dismissive comment and patronizing suggestion, never once stopping to wonder if the story had changed or if it had ever been accurate in the first place. They'd decided I was the failure, and they'd found evidence everywhere to support that decision. My retail jobs became proof I lacked ambition. My single status became proof I couldn't maintain relationships. My quiet presence at family dinners became proof I had nothing valuable to contribute to conversations. But the truth is, they weren't seeing me at all. They were seeing a reflection of their own fears about what happens when you don't follow the prescribed path, when you don't meet the milestones they'd decided were markers of a life well lived. For years I believed their version of me because I didn't have proof otherwise. And that's the insidious thing about being labeled. You start performing the role people have assigned. Because it's easier than fighting for a different narrative every single day when you're already exhausted from just surviving. But proof was never the point. I realize that now. I became someone new the moment I stopped performing for their approval. The moment I decided to study analytics, not because it would impress them, but because it interested me and I wanted to see if I could do it. The transformation happened in those quiet nights when nobody was watching, when I chose to keep going even though I was tired and frustrated and nobody was cheering me on. My worth wasn't created by that article in the business journal or by my clients' revenue increases or by the moment my family finally acknowledged I'd accomplished something. My worth existed in all those hours I showed up for myself when no one else would. In every lesson I completed when I could have given up. In every client proposal I sent out knowing I might get rejected, but trying anyway because I'd decided I was worth the effort. Your worth doesn't wait for applause. It doesn't pause until someone notices or validates, or finally gives you permission to believe in yourself. It exists in the work you do when no one's watching, in the promises you keep to yourself when the world's turned away, in the decision to build something meaningful even if the people you love most never see its value. I spent years waiting for my family to tell me I was enough, measuring my success by whether they smiled when I walked into a room or included me in their conversations about important things. And that waiting nearly destroyed me because I'd given them power over something that was never theirs to control. The moment I took that power back, the moment I decided to pursue analytics and keep it quiet, and let my work speak for itself without needing their approval first, that's when everything changed. Not because they changed, but because I did. And here's what nobody tells you about transformation: it's not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming who you always were underneath the labels other people stuck on you. And sometimes the people who love you take the longest to see it, because they're invested in the version of you that makes them comfortable, that confirms their worldview, that doesn't challenge them to admit they were wrong about something fundamental. I forgave my family, not because they deserved it immediately, or because their apologies magically erased years of hurt, but because carrying anger would have meant they still controlled my peace. And I'd worked too hard to build this new life to hand that power back to people who'd already taken too much from me. Forgiveness is complicated and messy and nothing like how it's portrayed in movies, where someone says sorry and everything's instantly fine. Real forgiveness is choosing not to let someone's past actions poison your present. It's releasing the grip that resentment has on your chest so you can breathe fully again. I forgave them because holding onto the hurt was like drinking poison and expecting them to get sick. And I was done making my well-being dependent on whether they finally understood what they'd put me through. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Didn't mean pretending the years didn't hurt or that their dismissal hadn't left scars I'd be dealing with for the rest of my life. It meant I could love them without needing them to define me. And that distinction changed everything about how I showed up to family events going forward. I set new boundaries after that engagement party. Clear lines about what I would and wouldn't accept in terms of how they treated me. And these boundaries were non-negotiable because I'd learned that people only respect the limits you enforce. I told my mother directly that I'd show up to family events as a participant, not as a project they were trying to fix or a cautionary tale they referenced to make themselves feel better about their choices. I explained to my father that if he ever made another joke at my expense, if he ever compared me unfavorably to my siblings, or dismissed my work as less valuable than theirs, I would leave immediately and he wouldn't hear from me for months, maybe longer. My siblings got similar conversations. I told David I wasn't interested in being his punchline anymore, that if he wanted a relationship with me, it had to be based on actual respect, not tolerant condescension. And I told Rebecca that her silence during years of mistreatment was its own form of betrayal, and rebuilding trust would take time and consistency, action, not just a tearful apology at a party. The first time someone made a joke at my expense, after I had set those boundaries, it was my Uncle Stephen at a 4th of July barbecue 3 months later. He made some comment about how I'd finally gotten my act together after years of struggling to find my way. And the implication was clear that my success was recent luck rather than hard work. That the years before my analytics career were wasted time rather than necessary foundation. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't try to make him understand. I just gathered my things, said goodbye to the few family members I genuinely enjoyed spending time with, and left that barbecue 30 minutes after arriving. My mother called me later asking why I'd left so early, and I reminded her of the boundary I'd set. And I told her that my presence at family events was a privilege now, not an obligation. And if people couldn't treat me with basic respect, then I wouldn't subject myself to their company, regardless of shared DNA. She was quiet for a long moment before saying she understood, and she'd talk to Stephen about it. And I knew in that moment that something fundamental had shifted. They finally understood I meant what I said. That I wasn't the people-pleasing daughter who'd absorb whatever treatment they handed out just to maintain some semblance of family connection. If you've ever been the disappointment, the one who didn't fit the script your family wrote, the person who spent years carrying labels that never actually reflected who you were underneath all their expectations and judgments, I want you to know something important. True transformation doesn't require their permission, and your worth isn't determined by whether they finally see it. Drop one word in the comments that describes your comeback, or if you're still in the middle of building it, one word that describes what you're working toward. Because I want to know I'm not alone in this experience, and neither are you. My story isn't special or unique. What happened to me happens to thousands of people every single day. Families misjudge their own children. Parents project their fears onto kids who deserved better. Siblings compete instead of support. And people get trapped in narratives that were never true, but became true through repetition and reinforcement. The special part isn't that my family finally apologized. It's that I kept going even when they didn't believe in me. Even when every voice in my head told me they were right about me being a failure and I should just accept my place as the family disappointment. After hearing my story, I want you to ask yourself something honest. What would you have done in my place? Would you have had the strength to walk away from family events and study, alone in your apartment for 18 months, with no guarantee it would work out? Or would you have stayed stuck in the comfortable misery of being underestimated because at least it was familiar? And here's the harder question: are you living your life right now for someone else's approval? Are you making choices based on what your family thinks, or what society expects, or what seems safe and acceptable, rather than what actually sets your soul on fire and makes you curious about who you could become? Because the biggest lesson I learned through all of this isn't about analytics or business success or proving people wrong. It's about the cost of living a life designed by people who don't actually know you, who've decided who you are without bothering to ask, and how that cost compounds every single year you let their version of you override your own knowing about who you're meant to be. Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace, or does it just feed more anger that keeps you trapped in the past? Because I'll tell you right now, this wasn't about revenge for me, even though it might look like it from the outside. It was about liberation. About breaking free from a story that was suffocating me and reclaiming the right to write my own narrative. Was I wrong for distancing myself from my family while I transformed? Should I have told them what I was doing and risked their doubt poisoning my motivation? Or was protecting my peace and my process the only way I could have succeeded? Let me know in the comments what you think, because I'm genuinely curious whether people see my silence as justified or selfish. If you want more stories like this about turning labels into fuel, about using silence as power, and about finally becoming the person you were before anyone told you who to be, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because I've got more to share about what happened after that engagement party and how my relationship with my family evolved once we were all living in this new reality where I wasn't the disappointment anymore. Don't miss the next video where I'll share what it cost me to build this success, the sacrifices I made that nobody saw, and whether achieving everything I worked for actually brought the peace I thought it would. Because that's the part of the story nobody talks about. What happens after you prove them wrong and you're left standing in the aftermath wondering if the validation was worth what you gave up to get it? I'll see you in the next video.